Wow, this is embarrassing. So I'm watching a recording now that came out on the 2nd of February, which is roughly 4 or 5 days ago. Um, it's titled Jordan Peterson, uh, Heather McDonald, comma Stephen Blackwood, what is higher in higher education? Question mark. Um, this I'm only about a third of the way through, or 30% of the way through. Yeah, so many things have come up. I wonder when I made my recordings if they were before or after. Um, because I mean, it's just amazing the resonance of the topics brought up. Um, Heather McDonald talks about she kind of talks about the problem with structuralism having this sociological reduction of things, uh, and the fixation of uh, and Jordan Peterson talking about all the things that he was talking about, somewhat related um, to these things that I was trying to explore in the dynamics of possibility in terms of how that works on an internal uh, uh, theory of uh, cognitive functions, and deep theory of mind. But what was this other point? There was just something that they articulated, which I think I sort of made the point a bit stronger. Oh yeah, the thing, when Jordan Peterson goes on and on about the sovereign individual, which I do think he has really illustrated the point beautifully, and he communicates way better than I ever could probably. I would just like to conceptually add uh, that what he could add to that, which would make his explanation so much stronger, um, would sort of to bring into in terms of the communication and negotiation that happens between the sovereign individual, that the kind of the internal source of that sovereignty and agency um, does have to do with an explanation of accountability, which he somewhat tries to illustrate as well in his metaphysic. That's fine, but psychologically, I think the thing that ties these themes together would be reflective endorsement and sort of Catherine Elgin's. Um, if you read her papers on that, I think that you could integrate that into a state that actually has all the moving pieces and shows how essentially this ideological warfare, it does invalidate communication because it does sort of remove any kind of agency from individuals, and they are just exactly what Jordan Peterson described as the mouthpiece and the avatar of just of group um, uh, sort of that moral consideration comes and is vested by group. Uh, the group entity is like a priori the source of moral consideration. That is how it is conceived in the identity politics game. And obviously, it's fundamentally rotten because that leads to a kind of wooden moral code within which anything can be disguised. There's a hidden sort of there's an invisibility in terms of whatever, um, because essentially they can't be honest about being reflective and upon their reflection endorsing a particular principle. So their principles have to sort of come by them from what the group consideration is suggesting, and somewhat and what someone appears to be transmitting the 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 uh, the group condition, the condition that is manifested from themselves, which just sort of is an apparent fact, is somewhat, it's just kind of, um, it's factually sort of ascertainable. And so you've got this fundamental external locus of control, which is completely devoid of reflective endorsement. And so I think it's easier to actually get into the explanation of the sovereign individual when you're talking about the importance of reflective endorsement, which is obviously somewhat also the mechanism of accountability, which sort of is the guarantor of agency um, in and epistemic responsibilism and epistemic agency, which is the substrate of sorry, I've just thrown all these terms in now, but that is part of the functioning of free will, of free speech, um, is that free speech is effectively facilitating the expression and articulation of free will in a co-creative uh, um, system in which communication is sorry is therefore a oh my word, I'm just going to use a metaphor, is then a wavelength of a kind of collateral um, access and joy of the articulation of free will, in as much as that you can sort of encourage others and model to others and communicate, which is what communication is, the sort of the particular character of one's reflective endorsement. You see, this is what I was trying to get Jordan Peterson beyond, um, in me making the point that I'm trying to make, is that I didn't like Jordan Peterson's sort of idea that you are a unique person. I mean, he didn't use it ineffectively, because when he said, "Oh, you are unique because you are unique by having 8 sort of uniquely intersecting group identities," which means that essentially you might as well just consider yourself an individual anyway. But I don't think it's actually a question of unique. What makes you unique is that it's your reflective endorsement that therefore you are accountable for. And so you have a kind of unique accountability uh, to your somewhat self regard. Uh, and when I say self there, I mean your mental state. In regards to your own mental state, you are accountable. Um, and that accountability is unique to you. And it is essentially the, yeah, and I think also the metaphysics of somewhat God is more apparent in the psychological explanation when you talk about reflective endorsement, because essentially reflective endorsement is going to have essentially a character, a manifest character, which you are in the image thereof. And so, in as much as you say that you name someone, that they have a consistent identity as an individual, what you are actually naming is the character of that reflective endorsement, of that particular um, to call it a journey, or that particular. I'm just trying to name, trying to find a label or a kind of semantic description of what it is that carries the the consistency of a reflective endorsement. I mean, I guess it's a particular access point of the word. It's a particular manifestation of the word in flesh, as it were. Sorry, I'm not being nearly as neat and tidy as Jordan Peterson is when he really systematizes this in wonderful illustrations that are accessible, and I am, making these very convoluted, somewhat suggestions as to how he can perhaps upgrade uh, some of his communication on these matters. There was some. Yeah, and it's interesting as well because I think I can almost marry the disagreement between Heather MacDonald and Jordan Peterson, in somewhat in the beginning phases of this conversation. Is I think Heather MacDonald, on some technical level, I mean, she's not wading into the metaphysical thing. She um, just kind of wanted to duck it and to make a more, almost, in a generic sense. She wanted to make a broader case that you don't have to be essentially, a kind of a transcendental philosopher to not go along and be happy with what the left are doing. And I do think Jordan Peterson is roughly correct that the left are only able to do what they're doing because essentially of their particular uh, perversion, which is a direct reactionary sort of negation of what Jordan Peterson is describing. Heather MacDonald, you see, I think is actually somewhat describing a conceptual form of Jordan Peterson's articulated metaphysics. So this is how I'm going to try to marry their two seemingly disparate points, which on some level Heather MacDonald tried to just kind of sidestep, essentially, because she just wanted to make her separate case, which she said is, essentially, it doesn't negate what Jordan Peterson was saying, but it's somewhat a separate thing. But in some sense, in the same way that Jordan Peterson kept on relying on this sovereign individual, which I must say I don't like without the qualification of bringing in the actual mechanics of it, which I think is this reflective endorsement stuff. Um, that is actually the mechanism of what is generating the sovereignty, um, is tracking with that um, capacity of reflective endorsement and holding yourself accountable to your own reflective endorsement. Uh, that's how the judgment goes both ways, the double-sided sword that is the tongue of the Alpha and the Omega. But anyway, um, that kind of mysticism aside, um, Heather MacDonald is making a case for the sovereign individual, but her illustration of the sovereign individual, which she is relying on, is effectively the seeker, uh, the person who is curious and interested and is looking to be enlightened, and has a kind of a kind of open mindedness, a kind of which ends up having the same kind of commitment to a kind of reflective endorsement. It still affirms that capacity of reflective endorsement. So Heather MacDonald is essentially just trying to say, I mean, I think in some sense Heather MacDonald then is making a valid, I mean, perhaps their synthesis would have been more easily achieved if she actually tried to get into Jordan Peterson's metaphysical system and try to sort of, uh, well, which he didn't do. So right now I'm really speculating and with a bit of conjecture in terms of just hypothesizing or hypothetically imagining how how they would have perhaps intersected with some seeming gap and space between them and explored that gap to try to sort of work out what the one was saying that the other wasn't capturing, and what the other's um, explanation seemed to be somewhat constrictive, and not permitting. But yeah, I do see an overlap, um, and I'm just sort of talking about what I would generally regard as the bridge between them. Which is that commitment to that psychological capacity, which is essentially an individual capacity of reflective endorsement. Effectively, in identity politics, there is no reflective endorsement. Um, there is just identity endorsement that displaces reflective endorsement, which is why they have to sort of feign this emotional, primitive, um, kind of. It's almost like Heather McDonald's example is quite brilliant. How people are having these emotional breakdowns because uh, the person in Harvard who is I don't know what they're called, the dorm master, or whatever it is, the person who is responsible for a residence in Harvard, is also a lawyer, and in a professional role he is the lawyer for Harvey Weinstein, but somehow, because he is, you know, playing a part of an essential role that is required for due process to occur, somehow he is bringing the essence of rape with him when he is in the vicinity of the residence, and causing these people to have hysteria, this kind of hysteria, and this sort of this mumbo jumbo sort of guilt by association. It's almost like being haunted by the negative identity endorsement, because that's everything. The epistemology is traced from there, because there's no independent epistemological responsibility. It's all just some kind of strange, divined reliabilism, trying to read the signals from the identity, which are the source and of moral consideration and authority. Um, and so you're just constantly looking actually for a Führer to be the representative and the spokesperson for the identity matrix, in terms of what will actually bring justice to the identity matrix that is the Führer principle, effectively. So these people are fundamentally, they have completely incepted themselves into the fascistic worldview. That's what the identity politics is. That's what their worldview is, the sociological reduction. Anyway, now I'm just going to make the point that I wanted to make as well, which is my psychologizing of identity politics. And, people that know about psychology, so this is kind of a Jordan Peterson sort of. I recently made what I consider to be, in my conceit, a very good explanation of borderline personality disorder. And I haven't actually made the same quality of detail in terms of vulnerable narcissism. And the reason why I'm bringing up those two personality disorders, or actually vulnerable narcissism is a construct, it's not a personality disorder, but because it is actually more complicated. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I do think identity politics is exactly those things. It is a combination of borderline personality disorder and vulnerable narcissism, or vicarious vulnerable narcissism. and those two things work together. I don't know if I guess I should give the context first. So this is going to be This is going to be somewhat confusing. So basically, in identity politics, I'm saying that there are two things. There is the identity, and then there's the adherent, and the complicit adherent that is trying to facilitate identity. And so the identity itself is actually borderline personality disorder. The identity has borderline personality disorder, and that will make more sense when I go into describing it. And then the adherent of identity politics is they kind of form a composite in the same way that an individual might be comorbid borderline personality disorder with vulnerable narcissism. And the vulnerable narcissistic aspect that is comorbid and trying to sort of let me rather read this because I made a note also. So let me just read this note because I'll actually butcher it if I don't just read it. Note about identity politics. Identity is bipolar disorder. The adherent is conditioned to be comorbid, supporting the supporting the borderline personality disorder with its vulnerable narcissism. Okay, sorry, I hope I said borderline personality disorder both times. If I said bipolar, that was misspeaking. Okay. Okay. Now I'm just going to describe identity. I'm going to describe. I'm going to describe borderline personality disorder. Okay, so and this will become pertinent as I get into this. Okay, so so some guy on 4chan on the advice section was asking quite an awful question actually. He said I don't even know if I should read his question. I mean, maybe the person he was describing doesn't even have borderline personality disorder. It doesn't matter because my response was just trying to explain to him essentially the folly of his idea if she does or so. But she very well could have from what he describes, I believe, but obviously you can't make a vicarious diagnosis. Anyway, so his okay, this is going to be quite blunt. So he asks how to keep a borderline personality disorder hoe. How to keep a BPD in brackets borderline hoe ? This one spent 3 months being super submissive and compliant to me, doing anything I wanted, treating me like a king until about a week ago. I think this was on her period and got a little upset the day before because I had plans I hadn't told her about and ran into her and her bestie and sort of paid more attention to her bestie than her. Then she gave me lame excuses for not wanting to meet up last weekend. Today I asked her if she wanted to hang out and she doesn't respond. I know the standard advice is move on and shit, and it's not like I'm crying because she was my world or anything. But I'd like to keep her with me because she was pretty good to me, lived pretty near home, and having someone to sexual activity me and cherish me whenever I wanted near home was giving me some mental stability I was lacking immediately prior to meeting her. Plus, she was very cute and kept me in touch with my compassionate tender side. So, how do I keep her? I don't plan on texting her for the next week at least, since I got shit to do, but any advice is welcome. Okay, so I said right at the start, you are stupid. If you chase her, that is more fuel for her than what she gets from worshipping you. You are in the devaluation, undervaluation phase of splitting. If you condone or feed into that drama by working with it, she will only continue to do it. She wants to see you sweat and suffer to the same degree that she was kind to you. If you want, uh, if you want con- to continue to experience the good, you have to play her game. If you want to try short circuit her devaluation phase and eventually get her back to being nice to you, you have to do two things, which might be beyond your ability and control. You have to be the most meaningful person in her memory that she has connected with, and you need to argue with her about her treatment of you, in brackets, fight back. But then totally withdraw when she starts reusing a bullshit pattern of counter argument. You have to tell her that her counter argument is erroneous and she is fundamentally trying to be manipulative while being fast and loose with her judgments and the process of arriving at the truth. If you care about demonstrating to her she is being unreasonable, if you care about demonstrating to her that she is being unreasonable, and you honestly believe you have accomplished this, and then withdraw from her because she keeps repeating the same rationalistic mantras of cherry picked conjectures to frame her narrative, then she will probably come back to you at some point, but it might only be after she has had exchanges from other guys who weren't able to shine a window onto her internal issues. And then I said in the next paragraph, but it's not worth it. If she comes back, she will apologize, but she will just do it again, with a different narrative and different bullshit excuses, because they just want to torture people with their delusional interpretation of reality. At their core, this is what they are after, because they want to pay the hurt they got as children forward onto others. You have tasted the honey, but it's just the deceptive sweetness placed inside a bear trap. Um, okay, and then he gave a short response to me. He said, "That's interesting. Where would you trace the line between working with their drama and short circuiting her by beating her at her game? I guess being genuinely unregretful about any shit she can throw at you, plus withdrawing from it as soon as it's manifest she's been exposed, yet there's no way she's going to be convinced in that moment. How would you start it? Question mark. So, uh, is this the right response? Okay, and then I said, not accepting their drama means not believing in their poker face enough to properly demonstrate they are wrong and properly debunk their delusional interpretations, which are always premised on their convenient feelings gifted to them by a superior truth. The convenience of these feelings, which will be engineered by selective memory and selective interpretation of events, means she will project crimes onto you and deficiencies onto your character. You have to properly defend your character, but not by claiming perfection uh, in her projected terms and definitions. Once you allow yourself to buy into her chessboard, you are never going to be treated well ever again. She will punish you for every nice thing that she gives to you because you won't live up to her interpretation of the narrative. And, oh, well, that's kind of comma perhaps. She can engineer on the narrative that she can engineer and project onto you at will, which becomes instant and automatic when you don't defend all the necessary boundaries that demonstrate you are operating outside her chessboard. She will do things based on her feelings, which are obviously designed to incept you into the chessboard. But if she targets a different person to feed her reality vampirism, she will only cycle back to you when her uh, juicier options run dry. I'm telling you, it's not worth it. They don't ever reach a stable point of reasonableness. The more significant you are to her, will make you a target of her reality sabotage. Maybe even she, maybe even if she has to accuse you of bullshit and send a suicide letter to the police, she will destroy her own life to try to prove to you that it's your fault. Even if you tell them that you won't give them life advice and that they are responsible for all their own actions and decisions, and you avoid and cut them off from siphoning advice from you, they will still hold you responsible for their outcomes. It's like identity politics. You can't win. And the more you try to manage it, the more drastic self-sabotaging they become, to try to force you to take responsibility for their fate, so they don't have to be responsible for regulating their own emotional reality. Their fabricated emotions are a metaphor for their underlying beliefs, and those beliefs are sadistic and solipsistic. They are only real. They are only real truth. Oh, they are the only real truth, and you are only a puppet on their chessboard. If you believe their chessboard moves aren't gambits, you are a fool. They catch you with showing you a web and you think it's intimacy, but it's just a spider slowly trying to immobilize and freeze you into a puppet chess piece. This is all they ever do. It never stops. They like the absolute control too much. They even suffer and fuck up their own lives because they just want the feeling of control, which requires the reality of someone else to fuel their chess game. They need someone to incept. Something that I should have added to this, which is an important theme, is that the the uh, the 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 emotional their obsession with not being abandoned is effectively is the feeling manifestation of the absolute control that they contend on the level of the chessboard. And I talk about the unconsciousness, but the that gets essentially. I mean, if they ever improve, it's because of the gold standard in borderline personality disorder is something called dialectical something talk therapy or whatever. But essentially through gaining an appreciation of that chessboard and seeing what they're doing and locating their sense of self as effectively maneuvering their life in order to set up essentially coercive, compulsive, manipulative sort of narrative projection. Once they can sort of see that they are actually doing it, and I mean, I've spoken to borderline personality disordered people. I really don't believe any of them don't actually know about the chessboard. Like, I have cracked through many people and got them to admit it. I mean, it takes. I mean, that most therapists have never gotten to that depth. Um, it's almost like a lucid moment in the sort of. It requires a certain amount of presence, perhaps even charisma, to sort of. I mean, I guess you could say that's just perhaps. I can't remember what that symptom is called, but essentially, you're just getting them to correspond to play a certain identity, which they are. Because they do have this kind of, I can't remember what the symptom is called. It's actually, it summarizes the thing well, essentially, that they can just sort of collapse, almost like a quantum field or a wave collapses into a particle. They can just sort of collapse into a new position with the new momentum from the wave, because they will just collapse into whatever sort of is sufficient to sort of try to continue to have that same sort of emotional fluidity that provides the same uh, absolute control. Anyway, I'm going to go into substantiating that a bit. Okay. And then I'm addressing him directly. I said, you are to fuel their chess game. So I just said, which requires the reality of someone else to fuel their chess game. You are happy for this diversion from your real life because it makes you think you can be important. Well, you can be important in a similar way to a well-developed person who is deep and profound, who opens up to you. A borderline personality disorder will open up to you, but there is nothing inside except the chessboard, and the person inside who is playing chess is never going to talk to you because they are a demon who is too dishonest to acknowledge itself and is unwilling to judge itself and reform. You will only ever get hollow apologies from the new chess pieces she will create herself into to continue the game, and then try use your rules to coerce you into playing her game. Another thing that I should have added here, essentially, is that the reason why that demon never gets unveiled, or essentially they continue to emotionally experience their own effectiveness, uh, um, is because they are disassociating from the capacity of reflective endorsement. They will not use reflective endorsement. They just will not. You can tell them about it, and then they will say, give me a rule so that I do it, because they don't want to ever have agency. They are allergic to agency. They are married to their solipsism, because the absolute control is too much to give up. They're addicted. Okay, so then I said, sorry, and then in my next paragraph, that's the thing to remember. The identity, I'm saying that borderline personality disorder is what identity is in identity politics, and it has no agency fundamentally. It's a kind of conditioned thing that is just always reactive and responsive to environmental conditions, and which are relativistically channeled by essentially its comorbid, in terms of the identity politics model that I'm trying to draw, in terms of its comorbid, vulnerable, narcissist, adherent, and sort of codependent, alliance and legion. So, okay, and I said in my next paragraph, 2 out of 10 would not revisit that roller coaster. Exciting the first time, then realize it's exactly the same every time, but she will get more desperate to coerce you into riding, and she will use any tool she can. You will not be safe. The vampirism will be thirsty. The deeper it goes, because they have no stable sense of reality, you could potentially get newspeaked into real criminal charges or made up accusations. You are dealing with someone who will rationalize rape as easily as SJWs accuse people of raping them in verbal exchanges. You are wasting your time, but maybe that's what you want for yourself, secluded diversion. And I said also be aware of defense mechanism phase. Another point to bring up, she will leverage her story about you to the next white knight advice giver. She will always trade up in terms of who offers the most reality that can be leached into her chessboard. So she will discard you if there is another more stable source of reality extraction and distortion. Because their game is fundamentally delusional, they require the ability to adapt to fighting/oppression against their game in order to more clearly play the chess translation of their lives on their targets or from their targets. They need to have confidence that their rules are good enough for all the pieces on the chessboard. So if you threaten her rules in her game, she will pursue you in order to try learn how to refine her rules by seeing if she can trick you into accepting your role that she measures onto you, on her chessboard puppet of you. Oh, chessboard puppet representation of you. The identity matrix, the identity model, the group entity, kind of median stereotypes or whatever. She will try to use any And I mean, sorry, when I said that as an aside, I meant that that would be the identity politics sort of uh, conversion of that. Uh, she will try to use any argument of resistance you make into a new rule she can use in her own life, so that she will not be responsible for her behavior or outcome, and you will get all the blame when any of her inconsistent expectations are not fulfilled. She will want the best of all possible lives, even if those lives are mutually exclusive. Her feelings will not bear any sacrifice of any hypothetical possibility. To force you into demoralization and confusion into accepting her projections and validating her domination of you through her narrative. Her reasoning will be convoluted nonsense, concealed as character assassination. So she needs someone who will absorb the blame for her accusations because she has a perfect character with always true feelings, which are always good. So her environment has failed to be moral to her correct simplistic standards, while her feelings are an amoral source of absolute truth. And then I continue to say, because the internal demon is unwilling to be accountable for these internal mechanics and projections, because the chess playing is unwilling to acknowledge itself as existing, because it's a never ending stream of emotional self righteousness, unwilling to stop and develop an accounting of its patterns and internal process, it can continue to masquerade as a naive victim of its own personal state of mind. It's too lazy and unwilling to build a model of integrity and start acting from reflective endorsement of its own consistent system of accounting. It's unwilling to invigilate or question its own convenient and concrete projections that it casts onto its environment. It might retreat from a projection, but it's usually a deceptive gambit, and even if you seem to believe the apology, it's it's a hollow apology. They are only hollow words because the behavior is just migrated into new excuses and roles and new roles. In brackets, the reinvention of a renewed chessboard, just with excuses that it's different from before, and that she is turning a new leaf, so that she can forget about her prior pattern of behavior, and the demon can go back to causing unquestionable emotions because she is a simple being that requires getting drunk on her own emotions. It's a form of addiction which is unconscious because it facilitates the self righteousness. So, the self righteous emotions displace the consciousness of having any kind of accountability or reflective endorsement. Uh, Actually, yeah, there was one person that I think I did actually fix their bipolar disorder. Effectively, I got them to create a persona which I encoded effectively with this moral schema of reflective endorsement that I effectively modeled it to them. And obviously, it was mechanical the first time they tried it. And I had to basically give them everything. But then I gave them enough dials, let's just say, to actually generate a internal uh, dialectical um, actually, that might have been how dialectical thing. Because I mean, this was a long time ago, and I remember I've had communications with people in psychology for a long time, and I mean, a lot of the things that um, I've come up with things that have landed up in literature. I mean, I've inspired a lot of things, but I mean, that's the life of a private researcher that doesn't have any credentials. Anyway, I'll stop self-aggrandizing. Okay, did I mention all the other things that I wanted to mention? Yeah, so that I think is a fairly good description of uh, uh, borderline personality disorder. And yeah, I mean, I just have to sort of talk about vulnerable narcissism probably, and then talk about how, because this is somewhat complicated, because vulnerable narcissism is itself so I'll have to sort of incorporate how that vulnerable narcissism is is depending on the borderline personality disorder as a kind of ideal, as a kind of epistemic landscape, or sort of it almost is, it's the model of, let's say, like truth or reality, or the epistemic kind of relativism itself, or something like that. But essentially it's doing it for that. Okay, no, let me. You see, in my mind, I'm quite tired right now, and I can't actually think of a really good description in my own mind about vulnerable narcissism. So I'm just trying to. So I'm going to add another recording onto this probably, but just from the borderline side, I think it's sort of the incorporation of when vulnerable narcissism is facilitating the borderline of the identity, um, and caring about the endorsement from the identity, from the borderline personality disorder. Um, it's able to depend on a particular currency, a particular medium of value, which is effectively set in place. So it's somewhat, it creates it creates the knowledge of the environment, and it creates the kind of objects which vulnerable narcissism likes to deal with and contend with, because then the vulnerable narcissism has a stable source of being able to vent its rage, and it has a stable excuse. So it's a kind of codependency between the vulnerable narcissism and the borderline personality disordered identity. And the identity, I can't remember, dysregularity or whatever that symptom is called, the identity malleability, and sort of collapsing into different states. That, seen from the vulnerable narcissist point of view, is kind of like an imagination engine. It's kind of like, well, you have actually impoverished me in an incalculable way by not living up to my moral standard, by not absorbing my rage and my judgment. What you have destroyed is possibility that can never be known, and therefore you have an endless debt of every potential possibility. So there's no uh, there's an unquantifiable, there's an unknown quantity. It's not an unknown quality. There's an unknown quantity which you can levy against those who do not absorb the kind of the narcissistic abuse, and the judgment which is effectively entrenched in these kinds of hysterical, hyperbolic uh, uh, claims, which are effectively sourced from the borderline personality disorder. So it can be seen as a kind of as a complicated complex. In some sense, it's the ideological form of a comorbid cluster B type personality disordered individual. But this is happening on a macro scale, effectively, um, via ideology. And so I do. I mean, the Nazis had this bullshit. This is why they had such problems with mental health, and why they were so fragile, and why they were so triggered, and why you had to kind of feed them burnings of books, and you had to kind of tell them about the latest Jewish conspiracy that was left behind in people's minds. It's the same kind of hysterical bullshit as these people that say that you have to decolonize your mind. Um, anyway, okay. I think that's everything I had to sort of express at the moment. So.